I've been behind you guys.
Yeah, there's a mixer board.
Lakeisha, we need you already. Ta-da! Yay!
Okay, let me try again. Hello, I'm Masha Zager. I'm the editor of Broadband Communities magazine, and I want to welcome you to the session on how an early focus on economic development can help broadband projects get started, find funding, and launch successfully. The longest session title at the conference, and we have a great expert panel lined up here. I was originally scheduled to introduce the moderator, Craig Settles, who unfortunately cannot be here, but we have another expert on this subject, Diane Cruz, who has graciously agreed to lead the panel discussion. And this is actually the second time I've had, not at this conference, that I've had the privilege of introducing Diane, who's stepped in at the last moment when to replace someone who could not be here. So she's a very not only knowledgeable but reliable person to have. Diane is one of the great pioneers of the fiber to the home. Her first company, Zoomy, was specialized in creating and running fiber to the home networks in planned developments, and mostly I think in Colorado. And her current company, Neo Fiber, works with municipalities and others to design and engineer and plan for and do business plans for the fiber networks, both last mile and middle mile. And she has a wealth of experience in this subject. So, Diane, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you, Marcia. And I think what she's saying is I'm the king of wing, so they can call upon me to fill in and lead the discussion. The purpose of our session today is really to talk about the nuts and bolts of how to make this happen. And if you are planning to build a broadband network in your community or in your region and want to learn how to do it, how to get it off the ground, this is the nuts and bolts session to have that happen. What I'd like to do to kick off our panel today is have each of us give our own introductions, talk about our backgrounds, as well as some of the projects that we're working on and what we're doing in the industry. I'd like to expand just a little bit on the introduction for me. I've been in the telecom business for 25 years, and the last 15 in the as an entrepreneur, starting various telecom companies. The most relevant company is the company that Masha had introduced, and that was Zoomy Communications. We were one of the early fiber-to-the-home companies, and we did design engineering, and we built a lot of the first municipal fiber-to-the-home projects in the country. And then we also decided to build fiber-to-the-home networks and own and operate them in master plan communities. And we can talk a little bit about the housing market as it is maybe cycling back and becoming relevant again after the pretty dramatic crash in the housing market. We can talk about lessons learned there. And then recently, for the past 5 years, I've been working with a lot of the BTOP grant recipients on all of the business issues that come up around fiber-to-the-home networks and middle-mile fiber networks. So those things include the business plan, the feasibility studies, engaging the community and the anchor institutions on how to get involved and why they need to get behind the project, as well as then the design, engineering, and implementation of these networks. So that's, I guess, where I'm coming from in this session. I'd like the other panelists to also introduce themselves as well. I'll let you start sharing.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Should have been a school teacher, huh? My name is Sharon Stroh. I represent the Indiana Metropolitan Area Network, or IMAN for short. that's located in Steuben County, Indiana, which is the northeasternmost corner bordered by Michigan and Ohio. My background is actually almost 20 years in the not-for-profit sector, and IMAN was established as a not-for-profit supporting organization of another 501c3 organization. So I kind of came into this by accident, but it's been a great learning opportunity for me, and now that I've been involved in this for about a dozen years, I find myself wanting to know a little bit more about how more rural communities might think about adopting not-for-profit status and looking at funding it from that perspective.
Hello, I'm Aaron Getwa. I work for Stern Brothers and Company. We're an investment banking firm headquartered in St. Louis. I'm based out of Chicago. And our bread and butter is primarily tax-exempt municipal financings, infrastructure, and we, in the past few years, have taken on a big public-private partnership practice. I've done a lot of alternative energy, all kinds of infrastructure financing around the country for tax-exempt issuers, and been involved with broadband finance for about 2 years now. We started with a corporate plan, one that we started with getting equity financing for, and have really taken them all the way through public-private partnerships, looking at some real creative financings that are outside of the traditional tax-exempt and taxable bond type financing structures.
And we'll get to talk about that too in more detail. I'm going to quiz Aaron on what those mechanisms were and are. And Heather?
Hi. Is this one on? Okay, that's not.
Here, you can share mine.
Hi, I'm Heather Gold. I'm president of the Fiber to the Home Council Americas. I have been in telecoms for over 30 years, so you all know that I started when I was 12. I've been on the long distance side. I ran the trade association that opened the market to competition during the Telecom Act. And then before coming to the Fiber to Home Council, I was in charge of public policy and access management for a company called XO Communications, which had a lot, and still does, a lot of fiber. So I understood that part of it, the long haul and middle mile part of it. And then I joined the council 2 years ago, and my focus is on helping as many people as possible understand the benefits of fiber to the home. And we have an online community toolkit which walks through many of the steps that you may need or might be helpful as you map out how you will bring fiber to the home to your communities.
Thank you for the introductions. I think what we'll do is we'll start first with how do you get started? So I spoke with one woman who is planning to build a municipal network, and her first words to me today were, "I'm so overwhelmed. Where do I start?" And so, Sharon, I'd like to ask this question of you first, and then I'd also like to give some input. But can you talk about the Indiana Metropolitan Area Network and how you guys started and what steps you took to get the project off the ground?
This is a business model that I'm not really sure I've heard in too many cases across the United States, although I'm sure there's plenty of them that I don't know about. IMAN was established, as I mentioned, as a not-for-profit. There were actually 3 reasons that we did this. The first one is that it became a fully grant-funded deployment. So there is no debt service on anything we did. So there wasn't anything to repay as far as infrastructure goes. The second thing is the subscription fees that are collected from everybody that makes a connection to the fiber are then focused back to the supported organization, which is the foundation, and they use it to circulate back into their community in the form of grants. whether that's trying to get lights for your Little League team or a bike trail or scholarships for students that are going on to higher ed. The third reason that it was established that way is because it became a very neutral opportunity for us. There were no political affiliations. There were no city or town jurisdictional arguments that had to take place. So it remained kind of a Switzerland arena for us. So those were the reasons behind scheduling it as a not-for-profit. As I mentioned, that's my background. I was actually CEO of the community foundation that adopted IMAN at the time, and then I switched and moved over to IMAN, and now they have a different leadership, but I was in on it from the beginning. So it was just a brainstorm that came about from some other partners that I work with, seeing how other organizations or municipalities were sometimes, and please don't misunderstand this, sometimes kind of held hostage by other incumbents, thinking that, you know, the only opportunity they had was for that local incumbent to come in and build their fiber infrastructure for them, and then you know, collecting the profits in the form of lease arrangements for a very long time, and we just didn't want to see that happen to our community. There's only 32,000 people that live in Steuben County, so it's not a very large area. Our county seat has about 9,300 people. But we are very much associated with the manufacturing industry, especially affiliated with the automotive industry. And in the late 90s, we were starting to see a decline in those manufacturing areas. And we tried to figure out what's the best way for us to try and keep them. You know, that's when retention efforts came about. The 70s were built or were spent building our industrial parks, and now we had folks that were just leaving them, empty shell buildings. We had nothing that we could offer, so we had to do something to get our economy moving. And you know, digital real estate appeared to be, you know, the answer to at least our dilemma. And we have really found a way to keep this sustainable, and it works for us.
Can you talk about the grant that you received and how you went about getting the grant?
Well, it wasn't just one. It's a culmination of many. It was about a $2.8 million project by the time we finished looking at the route map. There was a private foundation that gave us a match. If we raised X amount of dollars, they'd need it. There was the Utility Economic Development Corporation in our area that gave us a contribution of over $50,000. There were business grants. And by that I mean there were local businesses, and they have corporate offices, and those corporate offices have foundations or corporate giving programs, so it was a matter of running this up the flagpole to them. Cities and towns made accommodation for us in their fiscal budgets. And probably the largest investment was what we call major moves. As many of you may know, the state of Indiana leased the toll road to an overseas consortium. And for anybody that was on the 80 toll road, those counties were all given a portion of that sale. So we had some of those dollars to work with. Steuben County received about $33 million from that, and they earmarked a portion of that for the fiber construction for our county as well. So it was a culmination of many, many different kinds of gifts. We did not use state or federal funds at this time.
So I think that's a great example of being very open-minded and grassroots effort of putting together financing. I'm going to hold off on other mechanisms of financing for a minute and keep focusing on some of the necessary steps initially to take to get your project off the ground. Heather, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So hopefully this is going to work.
Okay.
Woo, great technology. One of the things I wanted to go back, because obviously you were a leader, so you didn't even think about it, but for most of us who are starting this project, the first thing you absolutely have to do is identify who is going to be the champion. You know, and you better have your elected officials lined up. It may come from the community foundation. It could come from your Chamber of Commerce. In Virginia, we've seen a lot of the economic development sub-agencies. Every county has an economic development. You're seeing that going on down in Roanoke, in the Virginia Valley, or in the Shenandoah Valley area. But so somebody decides that this is imperative to maintaining your economic well-being. You, in your county, you saw that. But then you have to build this core of champions, and you need to put that together very early in the process. Otherwise, you're going to run up against a stone wall every step of the way. Whereas if you can build, as they did in Steubenville County, if you can build a community, civic, and political partnership with real champions identified who's going to be the leader in pushing for this, that will make your initial steps a lot easier. It will also make any kind of grant application as you're trying to do the early stage planning much stronger, because you're going in as a group. And so whoever is looking to give you, or whoever you're looking to get grant money for, can say, wow, this whole area wants this. Or, and it's helpful to have the private enterprise behind you as well.
I could absolutely echo that. It's important to have a leader as well as a group of champions that are behind the project. I find when I'm consulting with municipalities, they often engage a consulting firm to do the business plan and the financial plan. And really another first initial step, even before the business plan and financial plan, is to talk about who you are and what you want to be and what's your purpose. So for example, are you profit driven or are you socially driven? And how do you make your decisions? So often when we engage with the community, we will sit them down and say, we can put together a financial plan for you, but it's different based upon who you want to be and what you want to do with this network. So we'll sit down and we'll have foundational meetings in terms of what type of organization do we need to set up. Do we need to be a nonprofit? Are we a for-profit entity? Are we going to try to do a public-private partnership? What does the organizational structure look like? And then when you have your organizational structure set up, that also impacts the type of funding that you can then go after. So, for example, as a nonprofit organization, Sharon has talked about the success that they received in terms of charitable contributions and investments into the network. And as, for example, maybe a municipality, you wouldn't be able to attract charitable contributions as an investment mechanism. So, foundation being, you need to figure out who you are, where you want to go, what kind of organization you want to be, and then what are the principles that will guide you. So what are the guiding principles that help you make decisions? How do you make decisions? Do we need to see a 30% internal return on investment, unleveraged, or do we not care about profit and we're doing this for socially driven reasons? So I would say that those are the first steps, is absolutely find a leader, gather your group of champions, decide who you're going to be, what you want to become, and what type of organization you want to set up, and what guiding principles will help you make decisions. And then the basic mechanics then of identifying where is the need and engaging with the community. So let's talk a little bit about engaging with the community and gathering anchor institutions to support the project and to identify what their needs are, and then to also receive some baseline information in terms of the economic impact and the social impact of building this network. So I'd like to pose the question, and Erin, you're kind of specialized in the financing piece. We'll get to that part for sure, but feel free to jump in. I know Heather and Sharon can talk in great detail in this, but
I'll just preface by saying the anchor institutions will actually determine what the financing is going to look like.
exactly. Okay, so anchor institutions are typically the schools, the universities, the colleges, the nonprofit organizations, the large businesses in the area, the industrial parks, the downtown area, the schools, what am I missing? The libraries. Those are all anchor institutions that are often the largest employers in town, and they're also the largest users of broadband, typically. So, Sharon, can you talk a little bit about how the community had been engaged and what type of work you did with the community to get them involved, and anchor institutions to get them involved?
Sure. As a community foundation executive, one of my roles was to try and convene people around whatever the pressing issues were of our time. Obviously, this became a pressing issue. What are we going to do about watching our manufacturing workforce dissolve? You know, how do we retain and how do we attract new business? So we did a lot of community presentations. Steuben County is wonderful. It's kind of shaped like a star. Our county seat, Angola, is right in the middle, but we have a northwest and a northeast and a southwest and a southeast municipality, all incorporated cities and towns. And so we did presentations in every single one of them, sometimes more than once. And we invited those critical players, those other leaders, members of business and industry, Chamber of Commerce, you're right, the CEOs of the corporations. We also invited city and town and county officials to sit at the table, and we would talk about what broadband is, simply because folks didn't even know what that definition meant. So we'd have to talk about what it is, and then we would talk about how it was used, but that there were applications that we hadn't even dreamed of that would probably come into play. Keep in mind that this discussion has been going on in Steuben County since 2001, when we did our first feasibility study. So there were a lot of presentations, a lot of fact-finding from the folks that may or may not use it, and why. We compiled all of that information. We responded to the concerns that were always generated in any small group that we had put together, and then tried to find ways that we could answer those concerns. So it was this whole piece of accountability and transparency, which I have talked about with my colleagues. I see Karen sitting here. Transparency and accountability. What is it that we're doing, and how do we stay in front of everybody with what are we doing, and then letting them know very specifically that we're not doing this in hiding, we're not doing this in secret. These are all very open to the public type meetings. From there we went on to having the same kind of discussion with our regional economic development folks, so that they knew what was going on, so that if they tripped over anything, they would let us know and could run some things back up north to us. You know, you manage this almost like you manage a political campaign. You know, it's our job to tell the story of what it is that we are doing. It's not enough for us to know about what's going on and the persons that were in the room, but we have to let people that weren't in the room know about it. So it was about making sure that there were press releases, or better yet, invite the press to the meeting and see if they can then make heads or tails out of it. Again, remember folks, you know, very small county. I knew who the editor of the paper was, and I knew who the radio news guy is. So, you know, we just incorporated them into all of our discussions. So they were in from the ground level, and they kept it very, very transparent, and they kept the public informed.
One of the projects that I was involved in was the UC2B project here in Illinois, the Urbana-Champaign project, and they received a large grant through the BTOP program. And in order to engage the community, we set up industry-segmented community engagement meetings. So we targeted the medical segment, and we targeted all of the hospitals, all of the medical establishments, doctors' offices, and we had one meeting that was for them. And what we have found is that there's a lot of funding that is geared towards telemedicine and telehealth, that when they're engaged in this process, maybe they already know about the grants that are available to their industry, that can become part of the grant plan, if you will. But we also did that then with the schools and the universities and the research facilities. We had a separate meeting for service providers and those that had infrastructure that had already been built within the city. And we engaged with the nonprofits in a separate meeting, and we had a meeting for government agencies. And what was interesting, and transportation. We had a meeting for just with transportation. What we found, we were a little bit worried because, for example, with the hospitals, there were competitors, and we were a little worried that they may not collaborate or that the meeting might not go well or that they wouldn't discuss what was going on. But what we found is that they have very similar challenges, and the impact of a broadband network helps solve a lot of their challenges. And so it was actually an excellent meeting. They talked about applications that they could not do because they don't have sufficient broadband. And we got a very good idea of how they're using the network, where the network access points are, what they need to connect, and then what they would do if they had fiber to homes. What would the impact of that be to them as a medical establishment or medical facility? And a lot came from that. The context of the meetings is that we were in an economic slump, and so there was a lot of issues that came up around that and how we could generate economic development with the broadband network put in place. But I would say that that's also a good best practice, is to have your educational, informative, community engagement meetings, engage everyone in the community because it does impact everyone. Talk to them about what you're doing. Talk to them about grant funding that might be available to them, that they are eligible for, that they could then perhaps contribute seed money to the project. And then also discuss how they're using the network and where they would go if the network was extended. So very informative and I think really important too to get the community behind the project and get them to understand what the project means.
Diane, if I may, this was also a really wonderful opportunity for those that were opponents to broadband to come to the table. If they got to a point where they were very vocal in our community presentations about the fact that it wasn't needed or wasn't necessary or they didn't know what to do with it, we almost always invited them to have some private conversation afterwards so that we could really get at the heart of what were the objections. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. That's what it became about. Because you're not going to find that everybody is going to be your opponent.
How'd you manage that then? So if they were talking against the project in the meetings, were they that bold?
Not in a nasty way. I don't think we ever saw anything that was terribly argumentative. But it doesn't take much for somebody to look at that price tag and say, I don't know where in the world you think we're going to come up with $2.8 million in 2009, 2010. I mean, everybody was looking around like, where do you think we're going to pull that money out? Well, we don't, first of all, we don't have to do it all at one time. The first gift we received was $150,000 and it connected 5 of the city buildings. And as long as we were going past one of them to get to another one, we dropped off some of it at the hospital and we dropped off another connection, as we were going past the school administration building. So, then they made contributions because they could see that it would be beneficial to them. So that's how we started that fundraising thing. So mostly it was about the finances. We started this project at a horrible time, but if not now, when? How long are you going to sit on the fact that we are economically, having difficulties and wait for something to blow over? So yes, we, the majority of the deployment of our fiber in Steuben County came at a horrible time for us, which was between 2010 and 2009 and 2013 mostly.
Do you want to talk about community engagement?
So I think Gary Evans, who I think is here, always says, serve food.
That's for at breakfast.
Yeah. He said no matter where they went, when they were building the broadband system, he said if you serve food, they'll come. It's good counsel, especially as you reach out to the residents. But I think, one of the first things you have to do, and Diane and Sharon touched on this, is you need to have an inventory of what is there now. You need to understand unfortunately, it may be that the hospital in your community is part of a nationwide chain and under long-term contract to somebody else. So you really need to develop a good picture of what's available in terms of demand for the new network, and also what kind of facilities are available to go into the asset pool for that new network. As part of the initial startup, obviously we're working with communities that are building fiber to the home, so we're always looking, how do you actually engage the residents and get them fired up about the potential of the fiber to the home deployment to the point where they will pre-commit. I think one of the beautiful things that Google has brought to building new fiber to home communities is the idea that you aggregate demand in a given location, and that's where you go first, because that cuts down on your deployment costs. If you have a whole community ready to go, that's going to be a lot cheaper than running fiber and then going back and doing the laterals one by one. So those are, creating that kind of competition among neighborhoods for the residents is good, but also you really need to understand what is available to go into the network. Can the school district, can you apply, can you get your school district to switch to, whoever's going to build the fiber network? Can they do that? And then that also opens up funding opportunities, because schools and libraries are eligible for federal funding. So that you really do need to have a good understanding of the actual service providers that are in your neighborhood who might be willing to partner with you, and you have to understand where your community demand is.
I'm going to build on that too, and then it gets into needs assessment and take rates and then financing. So building upon that concept, your biggest risk if you don't have grant funding is to be upside down, and this is very capital intensive to build a fiber network, and upside down meaning you have too much debt to service. So that's one of your biggest risks. So there are different best practices that you can deploy to mitigate that risk, or minimize your risk, or minimize your exposure. And as Heather had just mentioned, if you can do neighborhood competitions, if you're doing, say, a full-blown fiber to the home network, what Google did was they had various neighborhoods compete to where they were going to build first. And the reason why they did that, the business side of that, the reasoning, is that when you get to the magic number of 30 to 40% take rate on services, then your financial model will work. And if you can do that more quickly than 2 years, then you're much more ahead of the game. And that allows the financial piece of your business plan to work. So getting to 40% take rate is ideal. I think in their situation they didn't need 40%, but I think they did get close to 30% initial signups, and that's how they decided where they would build. Some other things that you can do to mitigate your risk is, who's willing to pay an installation charge? So oftentimes the community anchor institutions, they don't care about how to monetize the network, they don't care how to pay for the network or how to cost justify the network. They just know that they need it, and it's an expense that they're willing to pay. So oftentimes those anchor institutions will contribute for the funding of the network. But there's also a lot of businesses and a lot of business owners that maybe work from home, or people that just get it, and they know that they need high capacity broadband at home or at their business, and they're willing to pay for that. I think maybe 5 years ago that wasn't the case, because often we would be in these meetings and people would say, I don't know why anybody would ever need more than 7 megabits of service at home. It's kind of the same conversation that we had in the 60s, where somebody said, why would somebody ever need a personal computer at their home? Can't imagine that ever happening. Well, 5 years ago, the conversation was 7 megabits, and now here we are, fast forward today. It is very easy to see why we need this. So we hit a critical point where the average consumer, the layperson, the folks that are not in the broadband industry, they understand that they need broadband connectivity and they're willing to pay for it. So that will reduce your debt, obviously. You've got that revenue tied to when you're building. That makes for an efficient use of your capital. And that will lower and mitigate your risk of too much debt. Let's talk a little bit about financing. And Erin, this kind of touches on the business plan. One of the things that we also coach communities on as we're developing the financial plan and the business plan is to say, well, what are the financial feasibility objectives that we need to say that this is feasible? So what is it? Is it profit? Do you need profit? Do you need X% profit? Do you need a 30% unleveraged IRR? Or do you just need to be profitable? We look at a number of different metrics, if you will, to determine whether it's a go, no-go decision. So Erin, can you talk a little bit about some of the financial metrics or some of the conditions in which the project would be viable, meaning it would be able to get funding?
Yes, certainly. Everyone loves profit. I mean, the whole idea behind some kind of project is it really has to carry itself. And
Can you hear him? Can you hear
working out
you guys back there?
If and it really depends on the model. If you're looking at a project which really the initiative is coming from a public body, then profit is going to conceivably take the back seat. Operational efficiency always has to be there, or else that project probably shouldn't be funded or it needs to go back to the drawing board. But on the continuum between public-private partnerships, where you have a private operator that is really spearheading the initiative and going to a public body for some kind of public services, that private operator obviously needs to have certain profit metrics. And rule of thumb for debt service coverage, if you're looking for bonds, we want to be anywhere from over 1.3 to 1.4 times debt service coverage, depending upon what the revenues are. For truly private operators that are looking for equity-type returns, you really need to start at an IRR that is in the high 20s and above. And the operators know that. The operators will come and talk to a specific user, a specific group of public bodies with that in mind, in that with that objective. But what we look at mostly is, what do you want to be when you grow up? What's the organizing principle for this initiative? Is it going to be really spearheaded through the political process and the public body, or is it coming from a private operator to a public body? Just a couple of examples, if I may. Bonding is, as you know, the lowest cost of capital. It's a way to access capital markets and get a great deal of tax-exempt funds, but it's politically complex. It's hard to get. It takes a long time. That is certainly a nice holy grail, but not always possible and not always appropriate for a particular locality. What we do is we look at a situation when we come in, and we have a matrix. We look at all the potential building blocks for a project, and sometimes they're appropriate, sometimes they're not. But if I may, let me just kind of run down, because I think it's germane to the conversation. You start with public debt, which is cheapest cost of funds, although the most difficult to procure. Another form of bonds is what's called alternate revenue debt. Depends on really what the localities, what state you're in. You can access this in Illinois, for example, if you're a home rule community. Sometimes it involves a referendum. If you're a home rule community, it does not. But alternate revenue debt is debt that is issued by a public body. There is a tax levy that is authorized by that public body, but the proceeds are loaned to a private operator, and the debt service on these bonds is payable by project net revenues. So if project net revenues are sufficient, the bonds really aren't a balance sheet item on that municipality, on that issuing body. If project revenues are insufficient, then the levy is not abated and actually is used to pay debt service. It's a very effective tool. Again, politically complex, a little bit easier to get than true GO bonds. This was done successfully in rural counties in Wisconsin, for example. It was initiated by a private operator, and went to virtually all the rural counties in Wisconsin and used this type of alternate revenue bond structure. They use something called Midwest disaster bonds, but it's the same thing. It essentially is on balance sheet for the municipality in bad times, but off balance sheet if everything works well.
Can I just ask
very
one quick
possible.
question about that, just to clarify? So when you say a private firm, are you talking about a local service provider, or what do you mean by that?
It was a regional service provider that had expertise in rural upper Midwest type rollouts. They were looking to expand their initiatives in Wisconsin, and it took about a year and a half for this process to actually get done. But there was a successful capital markets raise. The actual bonds, because there's a backstop by a variety of municipalities, were rateable, but did not actually count toward those municipalities' debt obligation. It's a rating agency that the credit agencies will look at it, but it does not officially count as debt until it becomes debt. Going into the continuum, there's something called tax increment financing bonds, TIF bonds. Everyone loves to talk about TIF bonds. In fact, before this session, I was asked to talk about it a little bit, so I will. As you probably know, they're used for infrastructure improvements, real estate type projects in a specific designated TIF area where the property improvements that will be funded by these bonds presumably create increased property tax assessments and thereby greater taxes. And that tax increment is then used to pay for the bonds. It's a great idea. It seems to be a perfect fit in many of these larger infrastructure projects in municipalities. TIFs are used quite extensively in Chicago, for example. So far, I have not seen a TIF financing actually be done for broadband infrastructure rollout. There's legislation in some states, but the one thing about it, and this is just in my experience, the one thing that we need to work through is how you quantify the increase in property value that is really attributable to the infrastructure improvements through the broadband rollout. What we've had a great deal of success with is what we call service contract monetization, and it primarily is used in a public-private partnership model. But what we do is we make sure early on, it all comes down to really knowing who your anchor participants are going to be, a public body, an institution, hospital, higher education, or even a solid business, and getting soft letters of intent from these institutions and building a model which makes sense. And what we do is we make these service contracts as strong as we possibly can. And for example, we've been working with one higher education institution to provide, in addition to non-financial support, rights of way, demand aggregation, and so forth, is give us an anchor service contract, which I can take to the bank, literally, and monetize. There is often pushback with respect to some of these, some of the needs here. You can have minimum payments, capacity payments, things that are similar to take-or-pay contracts in the energy space, for example. We have successfully done that after many iterations. Not to say that the first time is good, but after many iterations, we worked out and come up with contracts that are indeed monetizable. And what it does is it gets the operator going. It provides them with some degree of core assets that cash flow, which then they can incrementally grow and use more conventional sources of financing. We've done this here. We've seen it work in Florida, and for very small projects, which are really the kernels of a particular rollout. What we've done is we've gone to banks and we've gone to non-banks. And let me talk a little bit about banks also, because they're so critical. Everyone has a banking relationship. They want a banking relationship, and clearly, at some point, they're going to be very, very important in this process, particularly on the private side of a public-private partnership. Banks, as you probably know, have been moving away from the asset class. They're very, very difficult to work with, and yet you want to find a way to tap into them with all of the things they can provide. They have incentives as well if it makes economic sense for them, for community reinvestment credits and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of the reasons why banks have been difficult is the project's been presented poorly. What you really need to do is you need to go to a bank, and we've talked with a few rural operators to do this. Identify your anchor targets. Look at everyone, and oftentimes the more discreet and smaller the community, the better. But talk to those people. Build your revenue models. Get a contract. Certainly start with a soft LOI, and take that to the bank as a business proposal. That is, you have to look at, there's an essential purpose need here. There's a very strong contract. It's long-term, and if a bank won't finance it, what we've done successfully is we've gone to non-banks, and in fact, those are leasing companies. Leasing companies, there are a number of them that understand the equipment, they want help, and in fact, many of these leasing companies are subs of banks. So they're successfully funding these kind of contracts and particular types of equipment, and they're doing it at very, very attractive terms. And as that infrastructure rolls out and begins to cash flow on its own, then conceivably you can go to their bank parent and get more conventional financing. So that's something that I just, in terms of being creative, contract monetization and using non-bank funding sources is a way to bootstrap and get these things done. Two other things: new market tax credits. Obviously, grants and all of the funding vehicles that are available through federal sources and state and local sources. New market tax credits is it's complicated. It's subject to annual renewal from Congress. It has been renewed each year quite successfully. We don't know what they'll do next year, but if it is, allocations are available. And you can get up to about 39% of a project cost through these new market tax credits. It's you need to have transactions or projects that are, I think, greater than $5 million, but it's a terrific way to get capital. Many new market tax credit districts tend to be economically disadvantaged. What we've done successfully, I believe this was done for a project in Ohio, is they used urban new market tax credits and patchwork. They gerrymandered where these tax credits were and built out a broadband infrastructure using wireless technology. So even if a part of the service area was outside of one of these new market tax credits area, it was adjacent to, you were able to get full coverage and get access to that capital. And finally, in terms of our building blocks, there's all of the junior equity, junior debt and equity and grant money that's available. All of this stuff is, what we do is we put it in a matrix, we see what you got, and we mix and match. Nothing new is being invented. It's just how creative you use these various building blocks together.
Does anybody have questions from the audience specifically for Aaron as it relates to financing? Eric?
Have you used IRB, not-for-profit IRBs on any of these transactions?
They certainly can be done.
Oh wait, did everybody hear that question?
And, let me get rid of the jargon.
Let me get rid of the jargon, which we so people really understand. Industrial revenue bonds, and there's a special class of them that are not-for-profit industrial revenue bonds. And the question is, have you used them for any of these transactions? And that class drives the interest rate down from a traditional industrial revenue bond.
IRBs used to be one of our favorite tools for economic development. They're still available. I am not aware of an IRB transaction being done for broadband, and in fact, IRBs in general, their use post-2008 has become significantly curtailed because prior to 2008, IRBs were credit enhancement bank letters of credit, and that's how we accessed capital markets. You could do a non-rated IRB, however, there were very few markets for it, in very few takers for it in the capital markets. So frankly, we've had a very, very difficult time using IRBs in the past 5 years.
There's a question in front.
During your discussion about contract monetization, what was the term of those agreements? During your discussion about contract monetization, what were the term of the agreements that you were would like to see structured terms?
We ascertain and we negotiate down.
Okay, that's good.
The longer, obviously, the better, because then we can go into more long-term capital market type solutions. And it doesn't need to be rated if it's a well-known hospital or institution, higher ed institution or business. We can find buyers for that, and typically they're going to be local banks. And we can go as low as about 4 or 5 years, because at that point amortization becomes difficult. But if you can't get a service contract from an interested user for an essential purpose rollout, then you really need to question really what their commitment is in the first place. But to answer your question, between 5 and 10 years.
Thank you.
I want to give you one more idea about financing and maybe some things to think about as you're building your network, and give you just a quick example. So the cellular industry is also growing explosively. And so what's happening is the cellular companies are needing to build up fiber optic infrastructure to connect their cell sites and to connect their mini cells and their tower locations so that they can enhance the services that they're offering to their customers. So these large cellular companies are building out fiber networks, and we were engaged with the city of Boulder recently, where Zayo is building a fiber network within the city of Boulder, and the state legislation is such that Boulder is not able to offer services as a municipality. The state law is set up that way. But they knew that they wanted to have a gigabit network in place, and there was an opportunity where they had excess conduit, and Zayo wanted to purchase that excess conduit. So we were able to value what that was worth to Zayo, and we could value that based upon the savings that they would realize by not having to install conduit. And it was significant. And then we negotiated with them that anytime they put in additional conduit where the city of Boulder did not have conduit, they would put in spare conduit for the city. But then at the same time, they would also build a 144 count fiber network for the city. And the incremental cost for Zayo to put in a 288 count versus a 144 count was nothing. Really, it was about $30,000 in incremental costs. Most of your capital cost in building a fiber network is in the actual construction cost, opening the trench, putting in the conduit. Fiber is so cheap. And so put in a lot of fiber. Start looking at other people that are putting in networks, and look to the cellular industry as well. They're building fast and furious, and there's an opportunity for you, no matter where you are, to partner with them and realize what that's worth to them, and then use that as a tool to negotiate fiber infrastructure. Okay, I have 5 minutes. Did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up.
Okay.
Diane's point is a good one. Anytime you are opening a street, you should be thinking, even if you're not ready to build a fiber network now, you should be thinking about how you're going to take advantage of that so that you have the capacity in the future. A lot of cities have their own conduit for private reasons, for municipal reasons, that becomes valuable to a service provider and helps buy down the investment. And the same is true for buildings that can become central offices. Anything like that can help spur the investment in the fiber network because it builds down that initial cash out.
I think we have 1 minute. 2 minutes? Are we out of time?
You wanted to talk about take rate?
Yeah. You want to talk about take rate real quick?
I just thought I would throw it out there, a couple of things. IMAN is about at 43% after about 18 months. So generating almost $500,000 a year annually, and about 30% of that goes back to the Community Foundation for grant making. So that's circulating a lot of dollars back into our community, and it never leaves Steuben County. These dollars aren't going to shareholders. They're not going to anybody that needs to buy the 3rd vacation home. They're going, to support the projects that are going on in our backyards for our kids and the next generation, and seniors and healthcare and all of those other things. So,
Love that.
Just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, I think we're out of time, and all of us are available for questions. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to go into your questions, but feel free to contact us and ask your questions. And thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.